All right, folks. We are going to get to the gem. It's gem time. Are you ready? Can you follow up that accent?
No, I don't have a good Irish accent at all. We talk a lot during this segment about the destruction that the banks have, done to our society at large, with the financial crisis and just their greed and cruelty and, cavalier attitude, basically, to the lives of most working people. But I also wanted to talk about another massive crisis that's going on at the same time. For a lot of rural Americans, there has been a massive loss of access to banks at all. So just between 2012 and 2017, more than 1,500 bank branches have closed in rural America. Wow. And that means that, people in these poor, deprived areas don't have access to, the simple kind of check cashing, even, going to an ATM, the kind of services that we've, grown accustomed to. And especially in areas where there's a lot of economic devastation, not having access to, being able to access loans or anything like that is a very big problem. And for the people in those communities, the banks that stick around are really, really predatory. So you're seeing people having, minimum account balance fees. So like if your account goes beneath a certain balance, then you get a fine from the bank. Yep. And a lot of these areas, especially like rural South Carolina, what they call a reasonable account balance level is like $200. These are places where the median average yearly wage is hovering between in the low 20,000 a year. I mean, these are not people who have tremendous amounts of cash to be sitting on. And people live lives, through overdrafts and these banking fees, and it creates a cycle of poverty where you are constantly working back your previous paycheck. It's a massive problem. And it's a problem for rural Americans. It's also a problem for working class Americans and for people of color. This is something that is absolutely ridiculous when you find out that a study that was done in 2018 found that people of color in the United States actually have higher on average minimum account balance levels that they are supposed to uphold as part of their banking, means that these banks are just subtracting money out of working class people of color's bank accounts that other parts of the country are not subjected to. So these are already people who make less on average than other people. These are people who don't have the same kind of economic opportunities as others, and they're being attacked basically by these banks. Now, we know how the terrible cycle of overdraft fees, in 2017, Americans paid $34.3 billion in overdraft fees. And again, these account fees really target poor and people of color communities across the country. So look, what's the solution? People definitely, they need access to banks, they need loans for the community, and, they need access to credit. Now, we also need to remember the context, too, in the United States, the important role that banks played in racial segregation in this country through, creating very predatory loans to Black people who wanted to buy housing and things of that nature, too, is that there's a whole role that the banking system has played in disenfranchising and impoverishing, large segments of the population. So, you can try regulation, but in the context of our financialized economy, that very much happened in the 80s, and that's when a lot of these fees started to come about too. It's when we moved from a kind of productive economy into an overly financialized economy. So you could try regulation, but, think about like the CFPB, they put regulations on payday lenders, who are another group that, takes advantage of people who are unbanked, who need cash checking, check cashing services, payday loans, etc. They put on regulations, and what happens when a right winger comes into power? Trump takes those away, right? So, you could try regulations, but what we really need to do is to create a new way of giving people access to banking. And that is simple. We can create public banks. Postal banking is a phenomenal idea, not only because it can immediately has the infrastructure to go into communities that are already underserved by national banks. We can decide the kind of rates that we're going to give to people in impoverished communities. We can get rid of racialized practices. We can get rid of practices that are basically only set up for the bank's profit, like overdraft fees and minimum account balance fees. We can also use these as ways to spur economic growth in areas that have been underserved. So we can say to our, public banks or postal banks that, we're going to give interest rate loans at very low interest rates to people in this community, right? Because this community does not have access to credit, and we need to spur, economic growth and innovation in that community. That's a way that we can actually, in a fairly quick and simple way, actually revitalize a lot of communities that have been completely left behind by the United States financial system. Because the current system is not working at all. It's not working because of the macro crisis that is constantly happening from organizations like Goldman Sachs, and it's also not working for poor and working class Americans across the country who don't even have access to basic banking services because of a system that is, has been created to prey on them from the very beginning.
Check out Marissa Baradaran, great
Absolutely.
guest on Postal Banking. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.